with open source. And now we have a special guest. So I'm going to tell you a bit about Jono Bacon. Born with the name Jono Bacon, he had no other alternative but to become a rock star. He started a heavy metal band, but realized that he's not that satisfied, so he wrote a few books, made the New York Times bestseller list, and then decided what every sane, hard rock and roller person does and moved into developing. And he became a developer and then decided that writing code is not enough for him, so he started managing communities. He did that at Canonical, he did it at GitHub, and many other companies, and now he's the, I think, #1 top expert in the world for developers communities. We have a great pleasure of hosting him here today, and I think that's it. I think the rest you can do yourself. Thank you very much, Jono.
Thank you. All right, how's everyone doing? All right, that's what we like. How does this thing work? I've never used a computer before. Or is this an iPad? Oh, we have to press something, okay. Is that Windows? It's okay. That's me. Thank you.
Control-L.
Control-L. All right, perfect. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be here for a few different reasons. First of all, you know, my old friend Billy, who I used to work with at Canonical, who's at Marketing MD, she's been pestering me for the last 15 years to come over here and saying how much of a fantastic city it is, and it really is. I've just had such a wonderful time being in Tel Aviv, and everyone's been so welcoming. But there's just such a great local tech community here. And I was at DevOps Days the other day, and it was a fantastic event. And I'm thrilled to be here as well, so thank you very much. A little bit of background. I used to serve as Director of Community for Canonical around the Ubuntu project at GitHub and XPRIZE. Wrote a couple of books for O'Reilly, write for Forbes, and run a little conference called the Community Leadership Summit in Portland, which brings together a couple of hundred community nerds to talk about the things that community nerds like to talk about. But these days I'm a consultant, and the reason why I started doing this is because I found that I had developed a reasonable level of interest and satisfaction in working on open source, but communities can be applied to so many other areas. And when you're a consultant, you get to work with all kinds of different companies. So how do you build a community around a financial services organization such as a bank, or networking, or entertainment, or other places? And it's been a really interesting journey for me because I've discovered that a lot of the core principles in how you build communities are pretty similar. Because fundamentally we're all animals, we're all human beings, and the way in which our psychology is connected to how we build growth and participation, it can be relatively consistently applied, but the specific way in which we do it massively differs depending on the kind of company and the topic and other areas as well. So this to me is one of the most interesting things in the world. Like, I'm firmly of the view that the way in which we make a better planet is to help people to bring their skills and their expertise together. We've seen that comprehensively in open source. We've seen that in many other areas as well. And you know, you get cases such as Wikipedia, valued at tens of billions of dollars by the Smithsonian, hundreds of thousands of articles and translations on that site. You get the open source movement, which has generated technology across the cloud. It's running the operating system in my pocket. Infrastructure, electrical grids are now starting to run open source. We've seen the maker revolution, where bits and atoms have been bridged together, and this has just been phenomenal, particularly for people who could never get access to building hardware and technology. Now we can do it easier than ever before. And then you get examples such as crowdfunding, where we're democratizing finance. You know, a good example of this is Star Citizen. They raised over $200 million with their Kickstarter campaign. So you too can go and support brand new technology and then have it shipped to your house a year later than they told you to. And what's been really interesting, I think, in recent years is people bringing the principles of community inside of a business. This has become quite a bit of what I do, where you'll get a big company such as a bank, and everybody's sitting there in their boring little cube, and they've got their list of things that they have to do, and everything is by the book, and it's very command and control. And it becomes siloed, and it becomes a difficult place for their employees to work. And kids growing up today, they don't want to work in environments like that. They're growing up in a world where you can work on open source, where you can contribute to a number of different areas, where this thing can empower you to be part of a much broader movement. One of the first examples that I experienced of this was when I was at Canonical. And I'd been at Canonical for about 3 or 4 months, and I got an email from a kid who was based in rural Africa. And he told me that he was incredibly passionate about Ubuntu. Because Ubuntu is an ancient African word that means humanity to others. So there was a cultural reference in this operating system that we were building. But he told me he would spend his days and he'd do chores around the village and he'd earn some money. And then on a Saturday, he'd walk 2.5 hours to his local town. He'd spend all of his money that he'd earned on internet access, which bought him usually around an hour to an hour and a half worth of internet access. He'd contribute to Ubuntu and then he'd walk 2.5 hours back. And it was just phenomenal to me, the level of devotion that he engaged in, because even though he felt like he was a kid in rural Africa, he was one cog in a much broader global movement. The result of that is you see these kinds of hockey stick growth curves, right? You see, not just in open source, but in social media and 3D printing and elsewhere, you see these incredible levels of participation. And again, I'm a firm believer that everything comes down to our psychology. We're always talking about what's the best forum and what's the best social media network that you should use and which marketing tools. But fundamentally, we have to understand the psychology of how we think as human beings. This was what my talk at DevOps Days was about. And I think that fundamentally, we want to do work that's got meaning. Dan Ariely, who's a behavioral economist, he's told a story about a guy who produced this presentation for a merger, and he loved working on it. He worked hard, he worked late, he slept at the office. And then the merger was cancelled, and he was demotivated, he was depressed, because even though he had a great time working on the work, it had no impact, it had no meaning. So when we build communities where there's a very clear impact, you get this kind of growth happening. Now we've seen this in open source, I won't dwell on this too much. The previous presentation was wonderful about that and painting a picture there. This is slightly older data from Black Duck, but this talks about the growth of companies running open source and building it for their customers and participating in it. What's interesting to me is this balance between companies and communities. Because a company is a very definitive culture. And those cultures vary tremendously, right? If you've got a startup, I was chatting to a guy, I can't remember, I don't know where he is, but he was telling me about a startup. They released their product a couple of months ago. We were chatting over there. And he's building this community. He's got a lot of control over his culture. But if you're Amazon and you've got 200,000 people working for you, it's a lot more difficult to define and adjust your culture in other ways. And then communities, they vary tremendously as well. So these are two very different cultures trying to be bridged. And as I've experienced just this week being in Tel Aviv, my life back home in California, the cultural dynamics there are very different to the cultural dynamics here. And with culture, you can't tell people what to do. It just has to evolve, which I'll talk more about in a second. So this is where I spend most of my time, is how do we bridge these two worlds? Now, there are opportunities and challenges attached to this. Opportunity-wise, if you can build a community and get the companies properly connected into it, you get way more efficient, productive development, you get better innovation, you get shared insight and experience from your users, you get diverse participation, which across the board scientific studies say that at a great level of diversity you get better results. You get staff, your staff or your community members, they have a great level of impact, which develops that level of meaning, and that in turn builds a sense of belonging. You get personal relationships and growth, and just a better overall network effect. That's all great. We'd like that. This stuff sucks on the right. This is the problem. Because how do you start with this? If you've never done this kind of work before, communities are just a bunch of hippies on the internet and we don't know how to talk to them. So how do we begin? And if you're a command and control culture, such as a large organization, it can be very difficult to kind of know where to begin and how to bring that in. The other thing here is that it crosses all of these subcultures. How many of you work in a company bigger than a couple of hundred people? How many of you work for small startups? How many of you just wandered in because you free coffee? That guy, he looks shifty. In any company, you've got marketing, sales, product, engineering. These are radically different cultures. And then you've got the different cultures of different offices. And that's difficult. Most people find that difficult to wrestle with. And companies operate in a language, and that language is revenue and growth. And you need to be able to define value in the investment as quickly as possible. And it will take you at least a year to build a community, to do it well. And then finally, from my experience, The executive team in a company is never the problem. They understand the value of a community. The people who are on the ground want to operate in a more collaborative way. It's the middle management layer, that's the problem. Because these people have all of the responsibility and less power. And they have to basically make it work. So the problem here is that I think a lot of people look at this and they think, it's a technology problem. You know, we'll go and find the right tools, we'll set them up, we'll do some social media, we might retain a marketing agency, a fantastic marketing agency, such as Marketing Envy is one such example to kind of do this work. You owe me $20. And you know, and we'll make it work. But the thing is that that's not enough, because as I mentioned earlier on, this is a cultural challenge. Building culture is really hard. And I don't profess to be an expert on this, but from what I've seen, you can't lecture people, you can't lecture a cultural change in a company or in a community. What you have to do, the way culture forms, is lots of people tend to do similar things, and then it becomes the social norm, right? So if you go to any part of the world, there'll be things that are written into law, and they're just the way people tend to operate. And we see this all over the world. So if you want to instill cultural change, you have to identify what is the thing that we want to accomplish, how do we build buy-in in it, and then how do we encourage that from multiple angles so it just naturally tends to form and take shape. If you send a memo to someone and say, this is the new way of working, then people will ignore your memo. The way I tend to think about this is, over the years, I have a peanut for a brain, and I have a very small brain and a limited capacity for like intellectual thought. So I have to break things down into simple concepts. And over the course of my career, which is about 20 years now working on this stuff, I've developed this thing that I call the community participation model, which is how I think about how you go about building communities. The thing is, you start out, you have a little person down here, and that's your target audience. And what you first of all do is you say, who are the people we want to attract? And we break that down by participation. Developers, documentation writers, advocates, whatever it might be, and prioritize those people. And then you want to get them to this. That is value, something that they have done that is worthwhile to them and worthwhile to the community. In a developer context, that's a pull request, as an example. And then what you need to do is you need to figure out how do we get that person to there as quickly and as efficiently as possible. Back in the 90s, when software came in boxes, people would generally say you've got 10 minutes to go from taking the shrink wrap off to something that's valuable. And we should take the same approach to our communities. The amount of open source communities that I've seen where it'll take people a week to do this, that's unacceptable. People will get bored because the world is demanding our attention and demanding it in small chunks of information with the impact of social media. Now when you get to that point of there, which is the start, you then enter into this. I tend to think of the community journey as there's three components to it. You start out and you're a casual participant. You'll help out here and there. You know, when you've got a bit of time, you've got a free evening, you'll do something. And you'll start repeating that generally, and then when you start repeating, you become a regular. And this is where it starts becoming a habit for you. It takes generally around 66 days scientifically to build a habit. If you want to lose weight, stop drinking, love your children, whatever it might be, it takes about 66 days to kind of do that over and over again, and then you don't have to think about it. When people really start participating and then they start caring about the rest of this, they become core members. From my experience, in about every 100 people, you'll have one will be your core, and about 10 will be your regulars. And that's how you tend to get this breakdown, which is why I've sized it this way. So these three areas provide three ways in which we can think about how we engage people. So when you've just got up to this start, and you've just done the first thing, you become a casual member, you're really nervous. It's like going to a school disco. It's weird. And believe me, when I was like 15, I looked horrendous. Like I had no luck with girls. So I was particularly bad in this area. So we want to give people confidence here. We want to make them feel comfortable. People in here, they just want to get their stuff done and they don't want you to get in the way. And you need to give these people white glove treatment. These are the people who will mentor everybody all the way back. The way in which we get people moving this way is we incentivize them and we reward them. We live in a culture where we do things and we get rewards. You go to work, you get a salary. You buy 10 coffees, you get a free coffee. You fly on an airline, you get free airline miles. And this is the method in which I like to approach it. So the challenge with that is that's general, but I want to get into some specifics. I don't like people who do talks and they just talk in very general terms. So I'm going to quickly spin through 6 sets of pragmatic recommendations. These are not the only recommendations, but if you're building a technical community that you want to scale, these are 6 things that I would recommend to do. I'm going to blast through this reasonably quickly so I don't suck up all of the stage time. The first thing is permissiveness and planning. They fight crime. Every community is an environment where people need permission to be able to participate. And so you need to make sure that your executive team is saying to everybody, we want to build a collaborative culture. The way in which we build a community strategy in a way that actually will be successful is everybody's got to play a role in it. A community strategy shouldn't just be constructed by a consultant or a single team member. Everybody should be feeding into it. And communities are really fundamentally cross-functional organizations. So you need your marketing team, your engineering team, your product team, and others to be involved in that. So what happens is if you set that clear permissiveness, and part of that permissiveness, really importantly, is we're going to suck at this for a while. Like, we're going to fail. We're going to get it wrong. Someone's going to accidentally post something private on the internet. Someone's going to say something silly. The only way in which we're going to get better at this is through making mistakes and improving them. And that's the first element. The second is enabling asynchronous infrastructure. Asynchronous is a word I don't think I'll ever be able to spell correctly. Every time you see this in any one of my articles, books, slides, that's the help of the spelling corrector thing. So what that basically means is you can access anything from anywhere at any time. You know, how many of you have worked in companies where if you want to access an internal system, you have to log in through a VPN, or even worse, you have to connect to a remote Windows desktop that's running Windows NE, year 2000 or something like that. Right? What's Windows? It's like Mac OS, but built in like really like 1,000 years ago. No, so the key thing about this is that the way in which we build communities is that everybody can see that information, they can access that information. Tools such as GitHub and GitLab and Bitbucket and whatever else have made this a lot easier. But this is important specifically for code and issues and communication. One thing I'll say very quickly, Slack is not a community building platform, right? So if you want to build a community, don't use Slack. It's not designed for it. Use something like Discourse or something else.
Like what?
Discourse? Yeah, Discourse is a forum. I'm a huge fan of it.
But isn't that very similar though? At least on the surface.
Slack and Discourse?
Yeah.
No, they're quite different. So Slack is like a real-time discussion channel, as people would say, pretty IRC. Discourse is more like a traditional forum, but it's designed for the modern era. Yeah. But why this is important as well is because when you operate asynchronously, you develop a history that's electronic, so people can see why decisions were made. If you have someone new to the company, they can see why a decision was made. So default to open as best you can, and this can require some intellectual gymnastics in what about our issues for customers or enterprise products. So we have to think a little carefully about this. But as part of that permissiveness environment, really try to get as much of this as open and asynchronous as possible. The default discussion in a company should be not, why should we do this? It should be, why shouldn't we do this? That, to me, is the most effective way of doing that. All right, I'm going to rant for a second. We've become way too obsessed in recent years with measuring stuff. Measuring, I think, if you don't measure it, then you're not managing it. And I think we'd all probably agree with that. But we're developing a culture where people will build dashboards and dashboards and dashboards of information. And the idea being, we need to measure every conceivable thing, and then we will be able to assess any possible pattern in how our community or our business is operating. I think that's nonsense, personally. Pick 5 or 10 things and measure them and focus on those things. The most important element to me is focus on the value that you care about. So if you like in marketing terms, you would measure where traffic is coming from, sources of traffic, the amount of growth that you've got, various other bits and pieces. In community terms, you'll have your own definition. But the key thing is you want to just measure the most critical components and then develop a hypothesis, such as, longer articles aren't getting us better traffic, for example. Test the hypothesis by doing something different, and then measure the effect of that. So this is, I think, really critical. The other thing when it comes to measurements is too many organizations only measure activity. So for example, the number of posts to a forum, or the number of pull requests that have been submitted to a GitHub project. That's a good way of, kind of in marketing terms, thinking about a funnel. The problem with that approach is it doesn't measure quality, right? So a GitHub request that is reviewed and merged in is by definition a very high quality metric because somebody else has reviewed it and it makes sense and then merged it in. So think about the action and the validation of those different elements. As I mentioned earlier on, incentivization I think is really critical. The way in which we build great communities is we plumb in all of those incentives to keep people moving from casual to regular to core. I think of incentives in two forms. I call them submarine and stated. So stated incentives is where you say, if you do this, you will get this. That can be a hackathon. It could be, if you perform the specific task, such as your first pull request, you will get this specific reward. Submarine incentives is where you measure the kind of behavior you want to see, and then you follow up, you essentially use that as a trigger to then follow up with people. So as an example, a community that I work with, thousands of participants, and we wanted to detect when they make their 7th or 8th contribution, because then what would happen is we could send them a personal email saying, we really appreciate all the great work that you've been doing. You never send an automated email, but you detect those kinds of patterns, because as your community grows, it's more difficult to see that with your own eyes. And what that results in is just random acts of kindness, because people get these emails and little rewards, and it's incredibly fulfilling and gratifying for the community. And then think carefully about the rewards as well. Intrinsic rewards are where you feel good. That's a thank you email. It's been written about in a blog post. It's been highlighted as a bit of a rock star in the community. Extrinsic rewards are all the swag, t-shirts, I don't know, branded speakers, branded chairs, branded everything, are the extrinsic rewards. Be careful with your extrinsic rewards, because some people will just see it as junk. You need to make sure that people actually want it. Number 5, community is part of the day-to-day. Now, what I mean by this is, a friend of mine who is I think is one of the most talented CEOs in the open source business is this guy called Martin Mikos. He runs HackerOne. He actually was CEO of MySQL, and he sold them to Sun, that company that used to exist. And he said in every one of his companies, community has to be something we all care about. It's not just something that the community manager cares about. Everyone in this company, I don't care whether you're an executive or whether you're sweeping the floor, you need to care about what we're doing. And that requires making sure that it's part of your overall company strategy, that it's prioritized as a key element of focus, that the tactics is something that you're involving lots of different people in, the fact that you're engaging across teams, you're breaking down those cross-teams silos, and being as open as possible. This, to me, is possibly the most important thing to get over. A company that doesn't make it part of the day-to-day will generally fail in building an effective community. That's one of the reasons why startups now are better set up than ever, because they're coming about in an open source culture, so people have grown up with a lot of this kind of stuff. And then finally, trust is earned, and we need to earn it. This is a really fluffy concept, because communities are, they're just people, and companies are just people. And what we need to do is we need to build a sense of connectivity and a relationship with the people in our community. That's not just working together on the same projects, but that's building relationships, it's becoming friends. Some of the best work that I've done in my career took place in restaurants, in bars, at social events, because that's where a lot of the relationships were sealed. So we need to be empathetic, we need to be mindful, and that's why I like to break it into those casual, regular cores, because you can think about their mindset when they're going through those different parts of the journey. It's being collaborative, it's incorporating your community members in that journey, it's building those relationships, supporting them. If they want to accomplish something, help them to get there. Like when I worked at Canonical, every month I'd have 5 or 6 one-on-one calls with members of the community who I thought showed enormous talent. And they'd literally sign up for work. But to me, it was like that was part of my responsibility in doing that. And then provide opportunities. You know, people want a chance to kind of grow and succeed, and communities are the most fantastic ways to do that. So I think that I'm done. I have absolutely no idea if I've got any time left. So, shall I get on?
Any questions?